Hey everyone, for our next course session today on growth and development themed COVID-19 and broken economic systems towards crafting a more inclusive and sustainable growth path, let's invite our chair today, Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Research Advisor, Khazanah Research Institute, and he'll be joined by Alan Ng, Chief Economist, Securities Commission Malaysia, Professor Branko Milanovic, Centennial Professor, London School of Economics and Senior Scholar, Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality, City University of New York, and Tan Sri Dr. Jemilah Mahmood, Professor and Executive Director, Sunway Center for Planetary Health. Please welcome our panel speakers. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Shamira, and thank you, Khazanah Megatrends Forum, for organizing this event. It's a particular pleasure as all three of panelists are old colleagues whom I've learned a great deal from over the years. Since you have just heard from Professor Milanovic, I will ask him to intervene last, but in many ways, he has the most interesting, broad, comparative perspective, which will be very important for our considerations of growth and development. The first session yesterday was, of course, as traditionally is the case, on macro and markets, but it really was about markets rather than on the macroeconomic situation which we face in the world. We face, to sound like a cliche, an unprecedented situation where we have economic slowdown in many parts of the world, which is not due to any business cycle or the traditional sense, but rather due to rather extraordinary events. And also, there have been very important challenges in addressing those issues. So in a sense, this is the immediate issue, but I think it is important for us to consider some of the longer term problems and challenges. For instance, it is quite well known that even before 2020, the Sustainable Development Goals were not on target. Progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals were behind. And we have heard in an earlier session this morning, Tariq Fancy reminding us that much of what passes as corporate social responsibility doesn't necessarily contribute very much to the agenda which we have to the global sustainability agenda, as well as the socially inclusive agenda, as well as the whole challenge of improving governance. But without further ado, let me invite the speakers to address us today. We have three, as I said, the distinguished speakers, and they will address us in turn, make opening interventions to address the challenge as we see it. The KMF has kindly made available their biographies, so I don't need to introduce them extensively. But let me begin first with our first speaker, Alan Ng, who's the Chief Economist at the Securities Commission in Malaysia. Alan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jomo. It's such a great honor to be in the same panel with not just one Leontief Prize winner, but two, and of course with Tan Sri Jemilah as well, who is one of the most recognizable face in our battle against COVID here in Malaysia. So I think I'll make two observations, or at least two comments, broad comments on our path going forward in terms of economic development. It's in particular focus to Malaysia, but I think these are points that actually can be applied more generally as well for economies that are similar to us in terms of development level. I think the first point that we really need to appreciate is that development is getting harder. Right? This is, I think, my first comment. The pandemic is clearly a huge challenge, and in many ways has reinforced many existing trends. But even prior to the pandemic, as you have mentioned, Prof. Jomo, is that the existing evidence, I think, persuasively shows that development strategy of using growth through integration in the global economy via export-oriented industrialization is running out of steam. Something that we are very familiar with in East Asia. So the current shorter-term problems in the trading system notwithstanding, for example, in the supply chain disruption and so on, technological progress and globalization over the few past decades have made it such that manufacturing is now a relatively less viable escalator of growth, and perhaps more important, job creation throughout the world. And the point being is that labor saving and skill bias technology has been reducing the traditional ability of manufacturing to create low and middle wage jobs as much as how it has been able to do so in the past. And this is a very important point for a country like ours as we contemplate how we move forward. The point is that even if we are able to rebuild our industrial base to what it was in the 1990s, mid-80s or 1990s, relatively speaking. So Malaysia reached our peak manufacturing in the late 1990s, early 2000. We started rapidly industrializing in the mid-80s. So, and that actually created a lot of growth and jobs, right? So even if we actually managed to, relatively speaking, go back to those kind of industrial base, given the current state of technology and of manufacturing throughout the world, it's unlikely that we'll be able to create enough jobs to sustain a prosperous and growing middle class and to arrest the secular trends that we are currently seeing in our labor market. I think this is a very important point. Could be proven wrong, so it could be with new models in the future. But I think it's prudent for us to prepare for a new model of development. Successful and sustainable rapid growth strategies of the past in terms of export orientation kind of development. Industrial strategy might not work in light of the changing environment. Growth miracles may be a thing of the past, right? So this brings me to the next point, really, on how we can actually then craft the right kind of development policy. I think development needs to be informed by the right diagnosis. This sounds ridiculously obvious, but we often fall for sound bites and buzzwords in our policy document and so on. Just to give you an example, for example, when we are if we are to solve the problem in the labor market currently by preparing young workers for the labor market or reskilling older workers, this will not be enough as when the inadequacy of good middle class job is driven by secular trends such as technology and deindustrialization. And this is precisely what has been happening in Malaysia, right? So the past 2 decades, we have seen a hollowing out of what we label as a middle wage job and gains seen in some high wage jobs, and more importantly in terms of elementary and traditional services jobs. In fact, for the past 2 decades, we have seen more than 10% drop in relative share of manufacturing and other middle wage jobs. And instead, we have seen equivalent 10% increase, more than 10% increase in jobs in sales and service category. So we are witnessing that. And I think the point being is that when we have the right diagnosis, then what we need is a different sort of strategy. So training, reskilling and all might be useful, but will not be sufficient. So all in all, I think combined with the fact that development is getting harder, that is easy development through manufacturing is no longer sustainable or viable to create enough jobs. You might be able to create growth for a certain small high productivity segment of the economy, but not enough jobs for the middle class, right? And also the structural diagnosis of us that the winning strategy for Malaysia in the future is likely not going to be one that's based on rapid growth, but one that can balance on the supply side, broader base productivity growth in the domestic economy, and on the demand side, a sustained expansion of the middle class. I think this would likely mean that we need to reframe our policy priorities and new narrative, perhaps given the theme of this conference, right? One that is, for example, instead of focusing only on export champions and the most productive segments of the economy, to also direct efforts into smaller firms, especially in the services sector, but more broadly in terms of broader productivity improvement throughout many parts of the economy for the purpose of creating good jobs and uplifting middle wage jobs. I think I'll stop here. So happy to take on any further comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alan. And allow me to come back to you immediately on one important issue. I mean, Branko and others have all reminded us that very much depends on the political settlement, that we are living in an age where capitalism is the only show in town, but there are varieties of capitalism. And a very crucial part of this, of course, are the political regimes. So although we may have the best of slogans in policy statements and so on and so forth, in the past we were tended to be influenced very much by Washington, increasingly by Davos and so on. But what does it really mean in terms of the direction? what kind of changes would be necessary and conducive to moving to the kind of desirable growth path which you just identified?
Very good question, of course. I think it's definitely right that. So I would unpack this question in terms of I think what we need to do in the country to actually chart the right path forward, given all that we are facing now. I think the point that I want to make is that state capacity matter going forward, and how we interpret the coming forces and how we can actually respond to it. I think the point on why state capacity matters is also quite pertinent for a country like ours, given our development level. I think here I would draw insights from the work by Len Pritchard and his colleagues in the Kennedy School. Really, so the point that he actually had a working paper recently, just this year. It's a very rough working paper to just show how development, national development, a broad-based conception of development can actually occur, and what are the driving factors behind it. I think his point is that economic productivity growth is important throughout, but it's not sufficient after a certain level of development. So then he draw on the other dimensions of development that is especially key when it comes to actually further moving along with the development path. And this is actually on the point of actually needing to have a more responsive state, as well as a very capable public administration. So and he did an econometric exercise, and he pointed out that is growth sufficient? Growth is necessary for all, but is no longer sufficient at a certain income level for us to move ahead, especially on things that is important like inclusion and climate and opportunities and so on. He finds that the income level is about Greece per capita income, and that is also incidentally is where Malaysia is now in terms of per capita level. So and then he showed that state capacity is really important. That is to have a responsive state, a state that's very responsive of the needs of the society and the community, and also importantly a capable public administration that can actually interpret the forces that we are facing, right? So, but very unfortunately, I think based on existing quantitative indicators that we have on elements of state capacity, we have either seen stagnation or deterioration over the past decades, and this is likely to pose serious limit to our development as we move to the next decade. So growth is important, but it's no longer sufficient for us to move to the next stage where we can actually have a more holistic, inclusive kind of national development. I'm not sure whether that exactly answer your broader question about which kind of consensus we are moving to, but yeah, that's my response. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Let's move on. I'd like now to turn to Tan Sri Dr. Jemilah on a couple of issues, if I may. First, I think we all recognize now that the COVID-19 pandemic is now endemic, and it's something we will probably need to have to live with for some time to come. And this is going to constrain and shape the situation in terms of both the economic recovery as well as the achievement and progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And the other, and more specifically, of course, Tan Sri Jemilah was involved with the last government in trying to bring about health system reform. And we are, and we have made commitments. Malaysia has made commitments to achieve developing universal health coverage, healthcare, as well as health for all. Both commitments of Malaysian governments, and I'd like to ask Tan Sri Jemilah how she sees progress in terms of economic recovery and so on being affected by the endemic status now of the pandemic, and what she thinks the likely prospects are for progress on improving the health system. Thank you. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jomo, and thank you very much to Khazanah for inviting me. First of all, I'm going to challenge your proposition of endemicity. No doubt we are all discussing about living with COVID-19, but as some of my friends in Africa will say, the narrative of endemicity is the privilege of those who've had access to vaccines. So in many countries around the world, it's still very much a pandemic that's raging and without enough equity in access to vaccines. Now, Malaysia is very fortunate because we have had, without doubt, a hugely successful vaccination program. And I think even someone like me who was so closely involved with it, I don't see the impact of our vaccination program till I'm actually here right now in Europe and realizing that how well we have done and, how our public has also really complied to many measures. But what the pandemic has exposed to us is that, we have an assumption of a good health system in Malaysia, and we do. But if you look at the data per se, in terms of our universal health coverage, if you look at the services indicators, we are, ranking below Thailand, Argentina, China, and some of the middle-income countries that are in the same bracket as us, which means we have some way to go. And the reason why we are not as successful there is because we've always looked at health from a perspective of a medical care system, whereas health is very broad. Health is really, the composition of health is also very much in relation to society, social factors, as well as environmental factors. So in countries, for example, like Thailand, who have probably less investment per GDP per capita in health, you would conclude that three factors actually promote the attainment of successful universal healthcare when you have strong political commitment, which I think we have. The second is civil society engagement, which is not so strong in Malaysia. And the third is technical expertise, which is also very strong in Malaysia. So we have some way to go. And I think the health reform that I sort of started with the sort of a little report card, where are we now in terms of the health systems in Malaysia, what needs to change? That's a great starting point for us to move forward. Now, looking at what we are going through now, and you're saying that we will have to live with this COVID-19, how do we bounce back economically? And I think that's the question everybody wants to know. Can Malaysia bounce back, and how do we do it? I think we can. I think this has been a great opportunity for us to re-look at how we do business, number one, but also what do we need to now invest in? Number one, vaccinations. Everyone needs to get vaccinated. And we know that we're getting there, but we know that for sure a lot of our foreign workers who may or may not be legally documented or have lapsed documentation, if we miss them out, then our workforce is going to be very badly affected. So that vaccine equity applies in Malaysia as much as it applies globally. The second is that we need to have a clear and robust testing strategy. We have shifted testing strategies from testing everyone and large scale to much more targeted and maybe only symptomatics. How do we now work with industries and businesses to convince them that it is in their business interests to actually invest in testing and protecting and safeguarding the safety of their workers so that their businesses will no longer be disrupted? And I think this will require cheap tests, readily available, and clear testing strategies. The third, of course, is the entire spectrum of testing, isolation, and support. And I think this is where digital technology will come in. I know the Ministry of Health is going to do this, but I think this is where the communication with businesses, that we're not here to close you down. We're here to help you continue operating, and that you shouldn't be hiding, those who are unwell, and that, this whole measure on strict lockdowns really has to be a thing of the past. We have to be much more sophisticated in the way we manage the health conditions. But without a doubt, I think that we know that without health, everything else doesn't move. So if anything, the Malaysian development plans must have a greater focus and emphasis on that investment in health, and I mean broader health. Last thing I want to mention is that collaboration is key, and I'm very happy to see the theme of Khazanah Megatrends Forum this year is around collaboration. We've seen this when we had the surge of cases in the Klang Valley, the way that the operations shifted was one that is not business as usual. It was bringing private sector. We had, Yayasan Khazanah leading the GLC Disaster Relief Network. We've had civil society, Mercy Malaysia, Malaysian Red Crescent, everyone coming on board. And the Ministry of Health then changing a little bit the way they work, and that is opening up and allowing that collaboration to happen and very rapidly scaling it down. Now being, those lessons being transmitted to other states as well. So if anything, COVID-19 has been a very painful experience, and, and if all of us have lost someone we know or someone we know who knows someone. And yet, I think it's this huge opportunity now to reset the health system and really, have no longer a dichotomous health system, but one that looks at health writ large as a broader perspective of social well-being. Thank you, Jomo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jemilah. I think I'm very glad that you reminded us that the whole discussion of the pandemic being endemic is something which has been driven largely by big pharmaceutical companies who stand to gain from the sale of boosters, et cetera, et cetera. And this, of course, is very worrisome. In fact, one can even argue that we have very perverse incentives. There's almost no incentive for the big pharmaceutical companies to work harder to try to completely eradicate the pandemic. And this, I think, is a great indictment of the system, and which, as you know, you are in Geneva now, and this of course is something which people in Geneva have been fighting over for quite some time, not only at the WHO but also, of course, at WTO. Right? But let me push you on another question, which you were an insider at a very, very crucial time. And we knew way back, I remember in February 2020, people like Madam Kang, the foreign minister of Korea, reminding the world about very simple things which the Koreans had done quite successfully. And one of the things she emphasized was the need for an all-of-government approach and a whole-of-society approach. Why has it been so difficult to do that here? And the points you made about FTT ITS, doing testing, so on and so forth. These are things which are patently obvious over a year and a half ago. Why have we not done the needed? Can you briefly tell us?
Oh, that should be in my next book, Insider Story. But, let's not look back. Let's look forward. It has to be done. And I think that we had elements of FTTIS, but we didn't have a real clear strategy or robust rollout of that FTTIS. And I think at the end of the day, this was, and I've said this very openly as well, this was our weakest link. I think the answer and the solution lies in automated systems and the willingness to work with experts in the data field and so on and so forth. With credit to Ministry of Finance, they brought in Bank Negara into KKM to look at the data and really capitalize on the capacities that institutions like Bank Negara have on machine learning and AI. And I think now, under the leadership of YBKJ, this is already being expanded. And you've seen now data being even open data, even AEFIs or the adverse effects of immunization are now open data for people to see. So I think this must be the way forward. But one thing that I must put on the table is that Malaysia is going through a real trust deficit in its society. So no matter what is being done, society is always mistrusting the government of the day, and that that mistrust added to sometimes very confusing communications has led to some of the challenges that we faced, and I think this is now being very addressed very well, but this goes to show even in countries like Korea, for that matter, who also went through, like us, an initial good start and then started climbing in the cases. A lot of it was also because people got very, very tired of the pandemic and then started to, flout some of the rules and the regulations that were in place. I think I will be remiss if I didn't say this. We need all to be very, very humble. Everyone who came in to manage the pandemic thought they knew something, but everybody did not know something either. So there were a lot of things in this pandemic that was very new to many of us who've managed crises or who've managed pandemics. This is a very unusual virus that started to show different ways that it was behaving. So I think the willingness to adapt and learn from each other is going to be very critical. And again, I think this could have been one area, we would have improved if we had listened more to people, beyond what is in the inner circle.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Jemilah. Let us now turn to Branko Milanovic. It's a particularly great personal pleasure for me to invite him. He's an old and dear colleague, a pioneer in analyzing income inequality. But I would also add, and this is less known, I learned a great deal, for instance, about understanding the transition economies from him. And he has, of course, been very, very important in terms of helping us to better understand a range of issues. And his most recent book, of course, deals with the fact that capitalism is the only game in town. And this, of course, is important for us to begin to wrap our heads around. I think it was almost 4 decades ago when Michel Albert wrote, his book on capitalism versus capitalism, I think about almost 2 decades since Raghuram Rajan and others wrote about capitalism versus capitalists. We have also seen that capitalism actually means very, very different things. To use your elephant analogy, if the different blind people touching different parts of the elephant experience and view capitalism very, very differently. And for those of us in different parts of the world, as we experience capitalism, it is actually changing. And and it's very different because of what our own experiences are. And of course, it has become in your own work. You talk about a political capitalism versus other types of capitalism, but you also acknowledge, I gather, that there are a variety of so-called political capitalisms, and I'm not even sure that we have the liberal capitalism which is talked about. If one looks back in economic history and the history of economic thought. Over a century ago, there were 2 economic liberals who talked about how capitalism, even then, at the end of the 19th century, was changing. John Hobson talked about the emergence of imperialism, and somebody who's less well known in the West, Dadabhai Naoroji, talked about how there was drainage because of the nature in which India was being embedded in international capitalism. Given all this, what do you think are the best things we can do and hope for, given particularly the strong ideological and social support which capitalism currently enjoys? I mean, you correctly pointed out, for example, that you have a variety of people ranging from Deng Xiaoping to Margaret Thatcher and so on and so forth who brought about this new stage. But you would also would acknowledge that what the kinds of capitalism they introduced were quite different. So please tell us, what are the prospects for what is the best case scenario you see for the future of capitalism in the world?
Well, thank you very much, Jomo. It is a pleasure really to see you, even if at a distance, but we almost can feel that we are nearby, despite the fact that we are spanning 3 continents, what I understand. And it is a special pleasure, of course, to speak after these 2 excellent interventions. I was really listening to Dr. Neng and to Dr. Jemilah with really great pleasure. I've even learned a lot from this small, intervention. And of course, I've learned over the years a lot from Jomo, whom actually I read carefully every week when he sends his letter. So let me try to answer also and to react a little bit to the previous presentations. I wanted to keep myself under some time limit to make 3 points. The first one was something which Dr. Jemilah knows much better than I, but as a lay person, I observed, as you know, there was this, and of course we know that we should really treat these mashup indices with really huge skepticism. But countries that were considered like to be very well prepared for pandemic were, according to that index done in October, I think 2019, by the Economist Intelligence Units and Johns Hopkins University, were the UK, US, and the Netherlands. All 3 of them have actually been pretty bad in handling the virus. And as you know, Vietnam and China and even South Korea were placed very low. And Thailand, for example, and probably Malaysia, but I don't remember. So we have learned that basically what we think was a good preparedness and good institutions can actually not deliver the outcome. So that would be my first sort of a general skeptical comment to many of the things that we believe that we know until it's revealed, in this case, really quite dramatically, that we really didn't know. That's really limits of our knowledge. My second point, where unfortunately all pessimistic, but I'll try to be a little bit more optimistic. My second point is we have been hearing for many years, for example, on climate change, how it is the issue that we are all in the same boat and how it affects us all. Now, take the pandemic. If there is anything where we really are in the same boat, because my health depends on your health, is the pandemic. It's not like rocket science to realize that if a person is sick and it's infectious disease, I'm going to get sick as well. So we are really in the same boat. Yet, what do we observe? And Dr. Jemilah spoke much more, with obviously incredibly more data than I have, but I'm simply observing that, of course, first, countries have been all selfish. Secondly, there was really closing down. Thirdly, as you know, the vaccines could be rather thrown away into destroyed or thrown into the ocean than delivered to poor countries. So we are actually seeing the very opposite of what we claim that we should be seeing. So that made me really very pessimistic also on climate change, where the threat is not as imminent. It's obviously a longer-term threat. So if we cannot organize ourselves on a short-term threat, which is very clear and manifest, how are we going to organize ourselves on a longer term? So that's my second. The third, actually, it was in respect to more directly to Jomo's question and Dr. Ang's presentation. I do also think that we are really at the end of a very long period, which started in 1978 to 82, both in terms of globalization, where we see really changes, in terms also of our ability to do jobs. That's actually positive for globalization, to do jobs remotely, that we have all, we are actually experiencing that right now. But also I would like to point out, not only are we able to do jobs remotely, but there is an interesting thing there, that we are actually, if I'm an employer and I'm hiring somebody because his wage, for example, in Burma is lower than in New York, that person, because of the difference in price level, could actually be better off in purchasing power terms than an equivalent worker in the US. So we have really bizarre situation, because in the past, if you had 2 workers and they obviously had to be in the same place, if somebody is paid £10 and somebody is paid £6, then a person with £10 is richer than a person with £6. But now a person who is paid £6 in Burma can be actually richer than a person who would be notionally paid £6 in England. So we have really seen this new aspect of globalization that I think has been has not been kind of discussed so far. And also what Dr. Nang mentioned, even in terms of export orientation, we are actually really to some extent at the end of a period. Now, that doesn't mean that we know what is coming next, but we do know that something has come to a certain end, even including, I think, our willingness now to face inequality. And the final thing, which is the biggest unknown, and yet maybe the most important factor, is the conflict, which is now really threatening to become a new Cold War between the US and China. So it's the elephant, literally an elephant in the room. We have to mention it wherever you are in the world. It is an issue which can actually totally derail everything else, and whose dynamic nobody knows. Even the people who are actually sort of ruling or sort of directly involved in the dynamic, I think, don't know where they want to go. So that would be my, I don't know if I just maybe went overboard on the pessimistic side in the very end. So I apologize for that.
No, thank you for being realistic, as I would put it, but also for reminding us that there are silver linings. I think both on the pandemic as well as on climate change. Our fates are linked. The fate of humanity is linked, whether we like it or not. And Tariq Fancy in the last session, in the opening session before your speech this morning, reminded us of the limitations of, many of the ESG and other corporate initiatives coming from Davos. But I've been a very poor chair in terms of disciplining, time discipline, and Branko, because you gave the speech earlier, I suspect that there are going to be follow-up questions from both the speech as well as from our session so far. So let me invite the organizers to share the questions they have for you. These questions have been thankfully curated. I'm not one of those people who can handle too many things at the same time, so let me ask the organizers to remind us what we have in terms of questions. Okay, the first one is the pandemic taught us in industry that machines don't catch COVID-19. Is this the end of human intervention in manufacturing with AI and robotics taking over? From Dr. Neo, Sun Bin from Penang, and this, of course, is an issue which Alan has dealt with in the past. But it's also the subject of a recent report from Khazanah Research Institute called the Network Nation. Could we have the next question so that we can also allow yes, thank you. What the people want and what leaders, politicians want or prepared to do are increasingly disconnected. How can countries grow and develop to address major pressing issues given the major hurdles are the leaders themselves? Very, very pointed question, which in a sense, I thought I posed to Alan, poor Alan had to respond to that. But in a sense, Tansi Jemilah also alluded to some of these challenges in her response earlier. Next question, please. I'm putting all the questions out so that you can speak together in succession. What COVID-19 has exposed is nations can achieve growth, but less so in distributing its returns. And this is more so when we see access to healthcare. Hence, how should we realign the idea of economic growth with the general well-being of the masses? From Mandeep Singh. And this, of course, was dealt with a great in a longer time frame, but in Branko's preceding lecture. I'm not sure. I think COVID-19 has highlighted some of the inequalities, but many of the inequalities are long-standing, as Branko reminded us. And many people would argue that they go back centuries, and depending on one's particular perspective or when all this began, this is something which we have heard about. Can I have the next question, please, so that we will invite the speakers to respond to all these questions together. Next, any other questions? I suspect there aren't any more questions. Oh, here we are. Oh, no. With the IMF changing its tune and governments having record deficits, are we seeing a return to a Keynesian model of policy making across the world? And how should this translate to the economic direction? Of smaller nations like Malaysia? Actually, the struggles which Professor Milanovic discusses in his books between different tendencies is something which is very, very relevant, and we see this manifest at the IMF. There is an effort to fire the managing director, who is from a relatively small and uninfluential country from Bulgaria, on rather false charges, and this I think is something which people are outraged about, and it's all because of one of the flagship publications of the World Bank. But there is undoubtedly a renewed role for Keynesianism. But often people think of Keynesianism today in terms of Keynesian fiscal policy, and it's important for us to remember that there is also Keynesian monetary policy. Some people like to refer to modern monetary theory as a manifestation of that, but I would say that this is something which is still very much an important option for us. But this relates, of course, to Branko's point about political capitalism and the possibilities. I think what we see right now is the whole world is embracing the role of the state. The question is, what does that mean? The role of the state can be very different depending on different political conjunctures. So the next question, please, and then I'll have to stop. There's a pattern of greater individualization of social contract, especially in advanced countries. What can be done about this? So at this stage, let me now turn it over to our panelists, perhaps in reverse order, because I didn't ask Branko a follow-up question. Branko, how would you respond to the comments and questions which have been raised by our audience thus far?
Thank you very much, Jomo. I would be very brief because I think that the questions really are directed. First, they refer to Malaysia, and secondly, really, I think that the other two panelists know them better. I would just for the, how should I say, the question about the sort of Keynesian policies, I thought it was interesting in the sense that when the pandemic hit and when there was finally a decision to first go with the lockdowns and secondly to actually, because the lockdowns go together with an attempt to cover up the losses of income that people experience, there was no question of ideology. There was no question of Keynesian policies. It was very clear that was the only way to go. So in that sense, there was a default Keynesianism. You know, we had in many countries in Europe and the United States spending which went into 20% of GDP and even more. That was unprecedented. And I think that actually by this default Keynesianism, maybe we are back to Keynesianism, although I would definitely leave this to Dr. Neng to answer, because there are really macroeconomic issues there that I don't know well, and they are particularly interlinked, as Jono reminded us, with a possibly new role of the IMF, which may be actually much less of a role than in the past because of regional organizations, and secondly, because of the ability essentially that many countries have discovered that they are able to borrow and to actually spend the money themselves. So I would actually stop here because I would be very happy to come back later. But for the time being, I would stop at this.
Branko, if I can just press you a little bit on one specific issue on the Keynesian policy, because you look at the world and in the Paris School, if I can put it that way. People like Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman have argued that rather than the government intervening as employer of last resort, as it might have in previous situations, they should now be the buyer of last resort, the purchaser of last resort. And this becomes very important in terms of keeping economies liquid when aggregate demand is severely limited. And using that role to provide, for instance, for nutrition, for basic nutritional needs, and so on and so forth. What is your view about some of the new thinking in terms of contemporary Keynesian policies, and how might they be relevant?
Jomo, honestly, this is not something that I know well, but the only thing that I can say from the income distribution side is that my own view.
We've lost you, Branko. Branko? I'm afraid we've lost him.
The UBI, Universal Basic Income. But the crisis has actually taught me that if we had UBI, we would actually have an automatic stabilizer and income replacement in place without having to go through government decisions and parliamentary decision or Congress in the United States. So it did change in that respect. It did change my own view, but certainly on broader issues, on macro policies, I have to defer to others.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to Jemilah.
Yeah, let me try to answer some of those very interesting questions. I want to first of all build on what was said by Professor Branko on the climate crisis that we are facing today. And I think it is a crisis. The drivers are the same, whether it's the climate crisis or the pandemic, the drivers are the same. And it is really the Anthropocene behaviors that have really damaged planetary boundaries. So I will speak about this much more tomorrow, but let's be cognizant of that because as we start ticking boxes on ESG and so on and so forth, I think we've got to be aware that those links of climate and health are very, very real. The second thing, in response to political leadership and how and society's demands of different things, I often ask myself, yes, political leaders are important. We have that in place. Sometimes we're happy, sometimes we're not. But why do we have to wait for politics to make important moves and initiatives? Now, I give you an example of the U.S. when the Paris Agreement was drafted and the U.S. refused to sign it in the first place. 50 mayors came together and signed it. And they didn't wait for the political leaders to sign this document. So if we look into the future, what is future society going to look like? Is it going to look like what we think it was when we started our lives at a younger age? And certainly COVID-19 has exposed to us the robust distributed networks that exist that actually, make or drive some of the responses and some of the things we've seen happening of, communities and societies helping each other to get out of the situation that they're in or their difficulties that they're going through. Many didn't depend or wait for government. So I think that's a very important factor to look at. And I think, that foresight to look at what future society looks like is going to be important. And if politicians are not paying attention, then, they'll be in trouble because, they will fail to understand how society has evolved. On health itself, I think that, I'm going to re-emphasize over and over again that we are investing in, treating illnesses and not investing in wellness and preventing illnesses. So if you talk about, any shifts in any health system or anything that we want to see in the future, that's actually going to help us, prevent whether it is a health system collapse or another pandemic or other syndemics that we don't even talk about. For example, in Malaysia or in Asia, non-communicable diseases are the highest in the world. 1 in 4 people in Malaysia are hypertensive. And we are an obese country, we're an obese region. So there are many health issues. The other things we don't talk about very much in relation to development is, mass production of food and antimicrobial resistance, which is going to kill more people than the pandemic. So I think, we have real challenges in health ahead, but we also have real solutions. And I think that, if we start shifting our attention to much more on, preventive healthcare, primary healthcare, equity for all. I completely am a big supporter of, universal healthcare and universal basic income. Then I think, we will start to find ways to be better prepared for the future that is ahead of us. More pandemics, more climate crisis events, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Jemilah. That was really music to my ears to think about this in a very holistic and comprehensive fashion. I'm really appalled that on the cusp of becoming a high-income country, we have so many NCDs, and many of them are related to something else I'm interested in, the whole question of diets and food. And, these are avoidable. Branko wrote at least one paper, maybe more, on using the football analogies. And this is really akin to shooting into your own goal. But let's move on to Alan. Alan?
So what I'm going to do is actually provide rapid fire response. But stop me anytime if you think I'm taking too much time. I think there are a lot of the breadth of question that was raised just now was quite good. I think I'll start with technology. I think the point is that technology is not destiny. I think there's a very important point that we should acknowledge. It's not like a natural force that's coming at us and we can't do anything about. I think since Branko is here and the topic of inequality, I think the very first proposal provided by Sir Tony Atkinson in his book on inequality, he provided 15 proposals on how do we deal with inequality. The very first proposal was actually on that the direction of technology should be the explicit concern of policymakers, and it cannot be left to firms and investors alone. I think that's a very important point to address the first point raised on technology and jobs, right? So we do not have to leave it to ourselves. And then on the point of politics being a hindrance rather than a catalyst for change, I think I was trying to couch in such a way that we need a responsive state. So that was my euphemistic way of saying what I think we need in Malaysia. I won't go further than that. So and then on fiscal policy, I think we are looking at a cusp of which we are actually re-examining the very approach of macroeconomic stabilization. I think Robert Skidelsky called it a silent revolution, but it's really re-emphasizing the Musgrave role of government stabilization, and the current environment actually call for such a re-examination. I think just want to add a tiny point is that business cycle is asymmetric. We have discovered since AFC and GFC and now, right? It's asymmetric in the sense that prolonged downturns actually have significant long-term and cumulative effect that needs to be considered for long-term growth, right? Recession can lead to destruction of capital and impedes accumulation, not just physical, but also unmeasured capital. For example, the loss in know-hows when a company closed down, or for example, learning losses. If you lost a year of learning, the next year when you go back to school, it'll be much difficult for you to catch up. So it's actually accumulative. And this, of course, is what we call scarring and so on and so forth. I think with this, I think leave with a comment, a quote from Keynes. Actually, he quoted this in the BBC interview when it was asked. The point is really this: like anything that we can actually do, we can afford. I think this is a very deep point that need to be appreciated. I think that what we can do is actually often limited by the supply side of the real. Do we have the right technology? Do we have the right talent? Do we have the right physical capital? Less so on the finance side of the thing. Happy to go through that in greater depth. I think one more point on the social contract. I think that's I'm glad that the person actually raised this point. I think we need to really revisit our social contract. That is the norms and the laws and the underlying institution that is currently underpin our collective social interaction. Like how we raise our children, engage in education, what we expect from our employers, and how we experience sickness and old age. Right, all these things: technological change, rapid nature, changing nature of job, the ever interrelatedness of global health, aging population, climate change. All these things are actually affecting our existing social contract. Right. So, for example, the precarity of work, a slow dismantling of traditional employer-employee relationship happening in Malaysia. 15 years ago, we are looking at 1/10 of the urban population is in self-employed. Now we are looking at 1/8. Right. All these things are slowly shifting. And now for example, look at education. The first 20 years of your life, you go through formal education. You think that will set you up for the rest of your life. Those are obsolete, right? So I think we need to ask the question, how can we actually then fundamentally reorder our existing systems and also equalize opportunity and security in our society, i.e., how do we actually come up with a new social contract that underpins our economic and social lives? I think this is one of those fundamental questions that we actually need to address. I'll end with one last comment on climate change. I think it's crucial that we are honest and humble about the situation. First off is that there will be macroeconomic impacts from transition in climate action. And chances are it will have a lot of costs that has distributional impact. And I think we need to be honest when it comes to and explaining the costs and so on. We need to make this urgent transition, no doubt about it. But I think we need to be honest about the costs that it could actually lead to, especially for emerging economies, which I think will be disproportionately affected by this transition. And I think what is even more important, I think, is the story is related to the theme of this conference. Really, is that we really do not know how the social environment will change. What we are looking at now is a situation in which, for most of us here today, this generation, and perhaps for a generation afterwards, we will be living in our lives in an ever worse climate condition, with global temperature rising and rising regardless of what is being done today. Even after we stabilize the level of carbon in the atmosphere, it will get hotter. Even after we stabilize global temperatures, the sea will keep on rising. For decades after the world achieved net zero, if we do whatever we do now, the effect of climate change will continue to mount, right? We just do not know how this will affect people, right? How about would the values and belief system that will emerge in response to these trials, and how government will in turn react? We just do not know. Again, I think it's important that we have the humility to recognize this uncertainty and to be honest about what we are facing, and therefore embrace this challenge that we face. Okay, that's my rapid response to all the questions that was posed just now. So, yeah.
Thank you, Alan. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to give you a response on quite a number of other issues, but you've also advertised the importance of Mariana Mazzucato's speech and the importance of the whole question of governments playing a greater role in technology. In fact, this is very much the case, although there's the myth that governments don't play this role. I mean, if you think about the major technological innovations in the US, they've largely been due to defense industry investments during the second half of the 20th century. The internet. I need not go through the list because we are running out of time. I'm sorry, I've been a very poor manager. We have less than a minute each for you to make your concluding statements, beginning with Branko, please.
Well, maybe I can just make one statement that I wanted anyway to make earlier, but maybe I can make it as a concluding because it really links my presentation on equality with what we are discussing here, the question of social contract. I believe when it comes to, there is, I think, a significant difference between many of the countries in Asia that have done extremely well, reflected, for example, in acceptance of globalization in Vietnam by, I think, 91 or 81% of the people, versus the situation in Europe, where France, for example, where in France you have acceptance of globalization, whatever it means in the question, being 30%. I think that the social contract in many Western countries has been affected in a way that in the past we spoke of the third world as being disarticulated. We now have a group of people, a significant percentage of the population that feel disarticulated or losers from globalization. And I think politically, this is the issue which has been driving politics in Western Europe and the US in the last 10 years.
Thank you very much, Branko. I'm afraid I'm being told to wrap up. What that probably means is that both of you, the last two, are going to be deprived of an opportunity to do any any rapping you might have in mind. But if you insist, Jemilah or Alan, okay, thank you so much. I want to thank all three of you. You have been very lively and also been very sporting in terms of, and most importantly, I think humility. I think the lesson we all come away from this session is how little we know, how slow we are in learning, how slow we are in translating that learning into action, into policy, and so on. And I'm terribly impressed by the depth of knowledge you brought to the session, but also by the humility which we have in terms of knowledge and its consequences. I do hope that we will be able to continue these conversations on some other occasion, because I have so much more to ask of each of you. But I'm afraid I have been very remiss in terms of my chairing of this session. And so let me thank you all again, and thank you to the audience for your questions. And thank you for organizers for your excellent support for this session. Thank you all.